Hi, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about anxiety and a new form of treatment, which I have found seems to be extremely effective when working with people. What I do is I understand that if you think about the nervous system, it's basically operating in terms of go, no go, acceleration or brake. In other words, we call this the sympathetic and parasympathetic automatic nervous system. And it's automatic because it's just happening all on its own. Anytime you get up out of a chair, anytime you engage in something, you're activating what we call the sympathetic nervous system. And when you sit down, you relax, you just let your muscles go, you're activating the parasympathetic nervous system. And so these two are like a yin and yang. They're constantly interacting at every moment. And your heartbeat is an example of that. Contraction, sympathetic, relaxation, parasympathetic. The interesting thing is, though, that when you think of this in terms of fight, flight, or freeze, anything that's a stressful or a stressor, whether it's coming from your imagination or it's coming from outside of the world, or your body is just interpreting information incorrectly, is going to cause a sympathetic reaction, which we call which is part of the sympathetic nervous system. And this reaction can be either fight, flight, or freeze. The interesting thing is, though, that each of these components, fight, flight, or freeze, has different emotions attached to it. So fight would be anger, and flight would be fear, and freeze would be more like a depressive type of state where you kind of shutting down. Now, anxiety or depression, in my opinion, are for the most part the same problem of part of the automatic nervous system. And that is, if someone is anxious, they're usually caught in the flight response. They're the number two that I was talking about, the fight, flight, or freeze. So they're caught in this flight response, and that means they're feeling a lot of fear. They're anxious. Some people believe that you can become anxious without really thinking about anything. I do not believe that. There's always some component going on in the person's mind that they're imagining or thinking about, which is triggering the response in the nervous system. Now, some people obviously might be more sensitive to sensory impressions, which is also causing a lot of fear or discomfort around them in the world. And that would mean that they are highly sensitive. So there's a link between being highly sensitive and falling into this flight response. Now, the interesting thing is that stress in general is always triggering either a fight, flight, or freeze. And a lot of procrastination is in the same alley, it's fight, flight, or freeze, as the depressed state, which would be the freeze response. So when we stop, we can't produce something, we can't create something, we can't go through something. There's a subtle sense of fear underlying the procrastination. You have to do it, so you start procrastinating. You start doing something which is counterproductive to what you're trying to get done. Then, of course, none of us have ever procrastinated, so you don't know what I'm talking about. So if we have the fight, flight, or freeze response connected to stress, the stress in and of itself is a matter of perception. And your perception is putting a label on a situation. If we're talking about like a form of social anxiety, no one likes me, I might get kicked out of this group, people might reject me. That type of social stress is very distressing. And I think it's because we human beings are adapted to want to exist within a group or a tribe. We want to have someone who is our people who are connected to us as part of the tribe. And what happens to a person if they're fearing rejection is that it creates a deep existential anxiety, because as a species, one individual human being alone with low technology, that means maybe a spear and a knife, maybe a bow and arrow, we're not going to survive very long out on our own in the wilderness. So we are programmed through nature to want to be considered part of a tribe or group of people. This is not necessarily true in today's world, but it was very true in the recent past. And the farther back in time you go, the more important this tribal feeling becomes. And this is probably one of the biggest problems we human beings have now. If we're going to just take a moment and talk about politics for like 2 seconds, is that we end up with this tribalistic loyalty to a certain party or a leader, and stop considering what are the actual policies, what are the actual things that this party is promoting, and what would be good to me or for me. But since we have this tribal instinct, we become very loyal to a certain political movement, and thus we stop being critical. At least a lot of people do. But anyway, we're not going to go into politics. That would just be way too long, and this is not a political channel. So we'll just drop that. The important thing to understand, though, is that if we're going to address issues of like anxiety and depression, we might want to think of them in terms of what I just said: fight, flight, or freeze, where the freeze response is the depressed state and the flight response is the anxious state. And of course, these two will intermingle. The interesting thing is, though, that the fight response is not just about anger. It can also be about determination, curiosity, trying to figure something out. In other words, what would happen if every time you felt a little bit stressed, you became curious, right? So let's take an example of this out walking in the woods. You're walking in the woods, you're walking somewhere where you are comfortable, you know the area really well, and you hear a strange sound. And this strange sound might startle you a little bit, and then you orient and look, well, what is going on here? And then you see maybe a tree had fallen down. It had been blown over and it just fell down. And then you think, oh, it's just a tree. Well, this is not going to create, for most people, a fearful response. It's going to first startle you, then you're going to want to orient towards what happened, and then you're going to figure out, oh, it's just a tree. The idea it's just a tree is an interpretation of what your senses are taking in. And that interpretation is going to determine whether the startle response becomes fearful, anger, or if you feel overwhelmed and you can't protect yourself and become more in a depressed state. But let's say you startle, you look and you see a big black bear on its hind legs looking at you and maybe roaring, and then the startle response goes from the interpretation of what you're seeing says, this is dangerous, and then you start becoming very fearful. And then hopefully you'll realize that running away is probably not a good idea, because that triggers their hunting instinct. It might just be marking its territory and saying, stay away. So if you look at the bear and you make yourself big and you stand your ground, it's going to probably back down. At least that's what a lot of people think. So if we go back to this idea of anger or determination or curiosity, that means that if you can understand that what's going on inside of you in terms of the fearful response, especially if it's anxiety, because anxiety is not connected to something that's really happening out there. It's connected to your own interpretation of what's going on out there. What you need to do when you feel the anxiety is to try to get out of the fearful response of wanting to run away. Or if you're feeling a little bit of depression, the depressed state, try to get out of that depressed state and reorient towards what is triggering you at the moment. And then mobilizing curiosity, because it's actually easier than you think to go from, oh my goodness, this is terrible, I have to run away, to, well, what's really going on here? What's happening? Oh, what am I actually feeling? And the trick here is to switch from the interpretation, oh my goodness, I'm going to die, this is terrible, to what are the sensations in my body that I'm misinterpreting? And for those people who can do that, it's almost like a miracle cure. They immediately feel the anxiety leave their body, because the part of your brain that's designed to react with fear is not going to respond to focusing on sensations. Sensations are, for the most part, neutral. And when you switch from, oh my goodness, I'm being rejected, no one loves me, and you realize that it's a thought that's triggered you, and it's the thought that is reinforcing the feeling. And this is different than saying, oh, well, you have to change your thinking. No, you have to change what you're focusing on. Let me repeat that. This is not a cognitive approach in the sense that you're going to switch one thought out for another thought. No, you're going to think in terms of perception. At the moment, you are perceiving a trigger and interpreting it as, oh my goodness, something bad is going to happen to me, and this is triggering anxiety. But then if you switch out of the perception of the interpretation and focus more on, well, what is actually going on inside of my body? What are the sensations there? What am I actually sensing inside of me or outside of me? And mobilizing curiosity, because then you switched out of, I'm going down the depressed road, or I'm running away in the fear mode, and you're switching over to the anger mode. Except instead of becoming angry, which might also be helpful to facilitate this ability to switch out and to become curious, well, darn it, what's going on here? And then gradually becoming more and more curious about the sensations, it's going to almost immediately relieve your anxiety, because the part of your brain that's interpreting is connected to your perception. When you train yourself to refocus away from the interpretation of the situation and just become, well, what do I feel? Do I feel like maybe an itch under my nose, or do I feel a pressing sensation in my chest? Do I feel warm or cold? Do I feel something like maybe pushing out from the inside, or something pushing down from the outside? Does it feel slippery, or does it feel rough? You're describing the sensations behind the feeling. You're describing the sensations which you are then interpreting as a emotion. And that emotion is then reinforcing the fear response going inside of you, where you want to run away if we're talking about anxiety, or it is reinforcing the whole feeling of depression if we're talking about a depressed state. And it almost seems like a miracle, because when people really get this, it just takes a few minutes, and then suddenly their anxiety just seems to magically disappear. It's really, really fascinating to see, and it is so gratifying as a therapist to see that people immediately move from anxiousness and depression to becoming curious. And it all really fits really well together in terms of how the automatic nervous system is working. So remember, the choice you have when you're feeling anxious is not necessarily to try to force yourself to think differently, but to refocus on what the sensations are in the body, and then just paying attention to those sensations. And because those sensations are not connected to, from a instinctual level, to anything fearful, it's going to alleviate the pain. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule, and we can talk about that. But if you've noticed this resonates with you, go ahead and drop a comment. And if you disagree and you have and it doesn't resonate with you because your experience is different, also drop a comment, because I definitely don't know everything. but I do know that I'm getting some great feedback from my clients in terms of this technique really helping. Okay, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.